Welcome to this explainer on the art of debriefing. When we think about healthcare emergency exercises, whether we're talking about a tabletop exercise, a functional exercise, or a full-blown mass casualty drill, we naturally focus on the action, right? But the actual organizational learning, it almost never happens while the sirens are blaring. It happens after the action stops.
So, that brings us to a pretty critical question. Can a poor debrief literally waste a perfectly good exercise? The short answer is absolutely. Yes. Imagine spending months planning a complex hospital fire evacuation drill. You run it flawlessly, but then you fail to properly unpack what just happened. Well, you haven't actually improved your preparedness at all. You've basically just put on a really expensive piece of theater. It kind of makes you wonder, why do people often remember the debrief way more vividly than the exercise itself? It's because the simulation is really just the raw data collection phase. The debrief is where the actual analysis, the real aha moments happen.
Just picture the sheer intensity of a simulated emergency control room. When you're running a mass casualty incident or maybe dealing with a massive communication system failure, that environment is intentionally designed to be high pressure. Information is scarce, demands are off the charts, the participants are experiencing a massive cognitive load. They're definitely not in a position to reflect on nuanced system flaws while they're just trying to keep their heads above water.
Imagine a healthcare worker practicing in full PPE. That is exactly what cognitive load looks like. Try coordinating an infectious disease outbreak response while you're physically restricted like that. Stress levels naturally spike, and our bodies react to these simulated emergencies very much like they do to real ones. That massive adrenaline rush fundamentally alters your memory and perception. So asking someone to learn complex systemic lessons while they're basically stuck in survival mode, it just doesn't work.
And that right there is exactly why we have to transition away from the simulated emergency. The real learning, it needs a psychologically safe, quiet space. The debriefing room. This is where we shift gears from reaction to reflection. But, you can't just flip a switch and expect people to suddenly be super analytical. You have to ease them into it. Which brings us to the very first step of the whole process. We start with what's called the hot wash. This happens immediately after the exercise ends, often right out there in the field. And honestly, this isn't about deep analysis yet. It's a facilitated moment specifically designed to let everyone just decompress. People might be frustrated, they might be exhausted, or even feeling a bit defensive about the decisions they made. The hot wash lets participants clear that emotional cache. It honors that very human reaction to stress before we demand any sort of objective evaluation. Then, once those immediate emotions have settled down, usually the next day, we enter the main or cold debriefing. This is a totally different beast from the hot wash. It's a highly structured review. We aren't just sharing feelings anymore. We're capturing specific, actionable feedback on our achievements, our challenges, and the critical gaps in our plans and procedures. We're gathering the core lessons we need to build the after-action review, or AAR. But, and this is a big but, the success of this analytical phase relies entirely on one vital element: psychological safety.
There is a massive trap that facilitators fall into right here. It's so easy to focus on individual mistakes and start assigning blame, rather than examining the systems, the plans, and the policies. Think about it. If a participant feels like they're being individually judged for a mistake they made under immense pressure, they're going to hesitate to speak openly. They'll hide their errors, and if they hide those errors, the organization completely misses the chance to fix the underlying system. So, creating a non-blaming learning environment isn't just some nice feel-good idea, it is a mechanical necessity for a successful debrief.
I want you to just pause and really think about this question for a second. Were we testing people or were we testing systems? It is incredibly easy for different departments to get into heated disagreements about who made the wrong call during a simulation. But a good facilitator has to continuously bring the room back to this central premise. We are not stress testing human beings to see if they break. We are stress testing the plans and the systems that we've built to support those human beings.
When we test systems properly, we totally shift our perspective on what makes an exercise successful. Discovering that a policy looked absolutely brilliant on paper, but completely failed operationally during the drill, that's not a failure. That is a massive win. Realizing that two departments totally misunderstood their respective roles is exactly why we run these exercises in the first place. Uncovering those hidden weaknesses now means we can fix them before a real crisis hits. Identifying a gap is the true definition of success here.
Now, facilitating this kind of realization requires a really specific kind of emotionally intelligent leadership. A lot of times, facilitators feel this urge to fill every quiet moment with talking. But silence is a deeply powerful tool. Sometimes, when a team suddenly realizes a major procedural flaw, an uncomfortable silence just settles over the room. A great facilitator doesn't rush in to rescue them from that discomfort. They might simply ask, "What surprised participants during the exercise?" That discomfort means they are processing the insight. They're uncovering the truth of what really happened. You gotta just let them sit with it.
To safely guide those realizations, facilitators rely on structured methodologies, like the plus-delta method. It's highly effective because you don't just sit there and ask, what went wrong? First, you ask for the plus. What went well and why? Celebrating those successes builds team cohesion. Then you ask for the delta, the areas for improvement. The neutral language here is absolutely key. We aren't calling them failures, we're calling them areas for improvement. It balances the conversation and naturally stops participants from getting defensive.
What if you're dealing with particularly sensitive topics? Say, a major disagreement between the emergency room staff and hospital administration about the triage decisions made during the drill. You have to structure that conversation very carefully to build trust. You don't just throw it out to the entire room right away. You start with small group discussions. Let peers talk to peers. Then, you gradually increase the size to plenary rounds, handling those most sensitive, high-friction topics one by one.
To make sure these discussions actually stay grounded in reality, we rely heavily on our evaluators. These are the folks who are capturing objective outcomes while the simulation was running. They weren't intervening, they were just quietly gathering unbiased data. Because let's face it, human memory is incredibly fallible under stress. Two people can remember the exact same moment completely differently. Having evaluators feed real, objective data into the debrief ensures the conversation stays focused on facts rather than subjective arguments about what people think happened.
Using that objective data, the facilitator can then ask gently targeted, reflective questions. For example, what became difficult under pressure? Notice how probing yet incredibly safe that is. Instead of pointing a finger and asking, hey, why did you drop the ball on patient intake? You ask, what made the process hard? This naturally guides the whole group to uncover those hidden systemic weaknesses, like, oh, maybe an intake form is just way too complex to fill out when the fire alarms are going off.
Here's another incredibly common scenario in healthcare emergencies. You pose the question, did communication support the response, or did it become part of the problem? During a crisis, interdepartmental communication is almost always the first thing to break. By reflecting on this together, participants might realize, for instance, that relying on their personal cell phones during a localized power grid failure caused the entire exercise to stall out. Recognizing that breakdown together, in a safe room, is where the actual organizational learning solidifies.
Ultimately, though, the debrief isn't just about feeling good that we talked it all out. It has to translate into action. We capture the lessons learned, draft the exercise report or AAR, brief senior leadership to get their buy-in, and finally, we implement actionable recommendations. We rewrite the SOPs, we buy the new radios. This is the absolutely critical bridge between the raw experience of the exercise and actual, tangible system improvement.
Which brings us to this incredibly powerful realization, derived straight from our source material. The focus of a simulation exercise should always be on locating and eliminating problems prior to an actual emergency. That's the whole point. All that simulated stress, all those evaluators with clipboards, all those sometimes uncomfortable debrief conversations. It's all to find the cracks in the foundation while we still have time to patch them up.
So I want to leave you with this challenge. Are your organization's emergency debriefs truly bridging the gap between an adrenaline-fueled experience and real systemic improvement? Or are they just a hastily run checklist item at the end of a really long day? Effective debriefing really is an art form. It requires psychological safety, structured reflection, and a relentless focus on systems over individuals. When it's done right, it is literally the most powerful preparedness tool we have. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it leaves you with some great questions for your team's next exercise.